They told him fear was the only language a kingdom understood. For 20 years, Alpha King Kalen believed it. He ruled with iron teeth and a colder silence, and no wolf in Volor dared hold his gaze. Then one morning, at the sacred border no man was supposed to cross, his arrow split the air and brought something ancient crashing down, something that had been standing guard long before he ever sat a throne. Stay with me until the very end, because this story will change how you see power, loss, and the price of a single wrong choice. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. Let me know where in the world you're watching from. The hunt began before the sun had fully committed to rising. Kalen rode at the front because that was where he always rode. Not out of ceremony, not for the benefit of the courtiers who scrambled to keep pace behind him, but because falling back felt like dying in increments. He had learned that early. At 7 years old, when his father had dragged him by the scruff into the training yard and told him the ground was only soft the first time, after that it was just failure. Kalen had not fallen since. Not in the yard, not in battle, not in council chambers where men twice his age tried to talk him into corners with polished words and older debts. He didn't fall. That was the whole of it. The forest that morning was the color of old iron, fog slung low between the pines, the horses blowing steam in the cold. 8 riders behind him, plus the 2 huntsmen with their bone horns and their hounds on long leather leads. The kingdom's northern ridgeline cut against the pre-dawn sky like a bite mark, and somewhere ahead the sacred border ran. A line marked not by walls or flags, but by the oldest trees in Volor, their bark carved with boundary sigils worn almost smooth by rain and generations of careful avoidance. Almost everyone avoided it. Kalen pulled his horse up short on a rise and studied the tree line below without speaking. His second, Commander Raid, came alongside him, the man's broad shoulders hunched against the cold, breath clouding. "Game's been thin past the 3rd ridge," Raid said. "Whatever's been keeping the herd spooked, it hasn't moved on." "It hasn't moved on," Kalen repeated, quiet, like he was tasting the words. "My king, something is keeping the animals back. That means it's territory. Something's holding ground." He scanned the shadows between the pines. "I want to see what." Raid did not answer immediately, which meant he had an opinion he was weighing against his survival instincts. He'd served long enough to know when to keep the opinion. They rode down off the rise. The forest closed around them, and the noise of the world narrowed to the creak of saddle leather, the soft drum of hooves on needle-covered ground, and somewhere distant the low call of a bird that didn't belong this far north in winter. Kalen noticed it the way he noticed everything. Filed it, didn't name it, kept moving. He nearly missed the wolf the first time. It stood at the base of an ancient boundary tree, barely 20 meters off the trail, utterly still. Not crouched, not threatening, just present. A silver wolf, larger than any natural wolf had the right to be, with a coat that caught what little dawn light filtered through the canopy and threw it back in cold white fire. It was watching him. Not the column of riders, not the hounds that had gone suddenly rigid and silent on their leads. Him, specifically. Its pale eyes found his across the 20 meters of frozen air and did not flinch. Kalen felt the weight of that gaze like a hand pressed flat against his chest. Behind him, one of the huntsmen hissed under his breath. "Sacred border's another 30 meters past that tree. Standing right at the edge, my king, right at the mark." "I can see where it's standing." The wolf had not moved. Its chest rose and fell with slow, deliberate breath, and that steadiness was more unsettling than any snarl would have been. Most animals ran from him. The ones that didn't charge were at least afraid. This one was neither. It looked at him the way the oldest wolves looked at a young alpha, appraising, patient, waiting for him to understand something he hadn't yet. He raised his crossbow. Raid's voice, tight. "Sire, it's at the boundary line, standing between us and whatever it's guarding." He sighted down the bolt. "That makes it a threat." "It hasn't moved. Neither has a tripwire." He loosed the bolt. It was a perfect shot. 20 meters, full stillness on both ends, the weapon well-tuned and the arm behind it tested across 15 years of war. The bolt took the wolf in the shoulder, angled through, and drove it sideways into the snow with a sound like something sacred breaking. It did not make a sound, And that was the worst part. No howl, no cry, just the impact, and then the snow, and then the stillness. Kaelin lowered the crossbow. The forest was completely silent. Even the hounds had stopped their restless shifting. One of the younger riders, boy named Drevith, 17, first royal hunt, had gone the color of old bone. Raid's face was unreadable, which meant he was being careful with it. "Mark this spot," Kaelin said. "I want a scout team through that boundary line by sundown. Whatever it was guarding, I want to know what it is." No one responded immediately. Raid: "Yes, my king." Flat: "Professional." Already doing the calculation of how many men it would take and what the penalty for refusing would be. Kaelin swung his horse and rode back up the rise the way they'd come, and none of the riders moved until he was a full horse length ahead of them. He didn't look back at the wolf. She knew before she reached the tree line. Lyra Ashthorne had been tracking the column of riders since they'd entered the second ridge, not because she feared them. She'd lived on the kingdom's edge long enough to know the rhythms of a royal hunt, the particular arrogance of hooves that never expected to find anyone in their path. But because Sable had moved, she'd felt it in her chest, that particular tug, the invisible cord between a bonded she-wolf and her guardian pulled taut. Not a warning, not a threat signal, something slower and more terrible than that. The pull of a thing already done. She was running before she fully understood why, her boots cracking through frozen crust, pushing through pine branches that slapped wet and cold across her face. The cold hit her eyes and made them water, but she didn't slow for it. She had lived on this edge for 24 years, had run this forest in the dark more times than she could count, and her feet knew where to go even when her lungs were burning and her mind was still assembling the evidence into something she could name. She came out through the last stand of boundary trees and stopped. Sable was in the snow, 20 meters from the carved boundary marker, silver coat spread wide, chest still. The bolt had gone through at an angle. It had been a clean shot. She could see that even from here. And the knowledge that it had been quick didn't help her any more than knowing a fire is fast makes the burning easier. Lyra crossed the distance without making a sound. She went to her knees in the snow beside the wolf and put her hands against the broad silver neck, still warm, still smelling of pine resin and winter, and the particular animal musk she had known since she was 5 years old, when Sable had appeared at the edge of her family's land and refused to leave. Her father had tried to drive the wolf off twice. She'd cried until he stopped. Sable had stayed, 24 years. "You were right here," she said to the body, voice coming out lower than she expected, scraped raw. "You weren't past the line. You were right here." She sat back on her heels and looked at the bolt shaft. Royal insignia on the fletching. She'd seen it before, on patrol arrows left in the tree trunks as markers, when the king's men came to remind the border villages that the land they lived on belonged to someone else. The insignia was a stark iron veilor rune, angular and aggressive, designed by a king who'd wanted his mark to look like a wound. She pulled the bolt free, cleaned it on her sleeve, and studied it for a long time without moving. The forest was cold and quiet around her, and there was no one to perform grief for, so she didn't. She just stayed in the snow with her hands pressed flat against Sable's flank until the warmth was gone, and after that she stood up. She put the bolt in her pack. She did not cry. She had learned a long time ago that crying was something you did when you still expected mercy from the world, and the world had cured her of that particular expectation before she was old enough to understand what she'd lost. She started walking back toward the ruins. The ruins were 3 hours southeast of where Sable had fallen, tucked into a collapsed hillside so thoroughly overgrown that a rider could pass within 10 meters and see nothing but scrub brush and old stone. Lyra had found them as a girl, not long after Sable had started spending her days close to this quadrant of the border. She'd spent years digging the chambers out carefully, one season's work at a time, with no tools but what she could carry on her own back, and no help because no one in the border settlements came close enough to the sacred land to notice what she was doing. She'd never fully understood why she kept working on the site. She understood better now. She ducked through the stone arch entrance, pulling a wax-sealed lamp from the hook inside where she always left it, and struck a light. The chamber opened below her in shallow steps carved directly into bedrock. and the walls were covered floor to ceiling in symbols she had spent 6 years trying to decipher. Not border markers, not hunting claims. Something older than that. A layered script that overlapped in some places, as if multiple hands had added to it across different centuries, all of them pointing toward the same central image carved above the far wall's only door. A wolf, stylized but unmistakable, and beneath the wolf, a bloodline mark she had seen exactly once before. On the papers her mother had pressed into her hands at age 8, the morning before she died. Lyra set the lamp on its stone shelf and stood in front of the far wall, and let herself look at it the way she'd been unable to look at it for 2 years now, since she'd finally uncovered enough of the chamber wall to put together what she was seeing. The bloodline mark was the founding sigil of Valor's original ruling line. Not the iron rune of the current throne, but the older one. The one that appeared in fragments of pre-conquest text she'd found in a trader's discarded collection and paid 3 months of her wages for. Her mother's papers had that sigil on the first page. Lyra pressed her back against the chamber wall, closed her eyes, and breathed. Sable had not been wandering the boundary because of territory. She had been standing watch. Over this site. Over the hill beneath which it sat. Over whatever lay deeper than this chamber and connected this bloodline mark to whatever the royal palace sat on top of. She opened her eyes. "What were you protecting me from?" she said to the empty room, and her voice came back to her off the old stone flat and hollow. No answer. There was never an answer from the dead, and she had stopped expecting one. But there was the door in the far wall, which she had never managed to fully excavate, and she was out of reasons to wait. 4 days later, Kaelin was told that the scout team he'd sent through the boundary line had found nothing. Nothing, he said. The scout captain, a veteran named Orseth, long-faced and careful, stood at attention in the middle of the war room and did not let himself look anywhere but the king's chin. "Cleared 2 kilometers of territory, my king. No structures, no concealed fortifications, no evidence of recent occupation. No evidence of why the deer herds have been running south for the last 3 seasons. No, sir." Kaelin looked at Orseth for a long moment. The scout captain did not flinch, but the muscle at the corner of his jaw twitched. "You looked," Kaelin said, "thoroughly." "What did you feel?" Orseth blinked once. "My king?" "In the woods. What did it feel like?" The captain's careful professionalism cracked slightly, like a stone under pressure. "Cold," he said after a beat. "Quiet. The kind of quiet that—" He stopped himself. "That what?" "That feels like it's listening," Orseth said very quietly, and then looked like he regretted it. Kaelin dismissed him. He stood alone in the war room and looked at the map spread across the oak table, the northern border marked in faded ink. 3 seasons of thin game. Animals that should have moved along established routes running south instead, year on year, giving the sacred territory a wider and wider berth, as if the avoidance were growing, as if something was pushing them out. And now the wolf that had been holding the boundary was gone. He had not thought about the wolf since the morning he'd shot it, which was his standard practice with things that were done. He filed them away and moved to the next problem. The silver wolf was archived under territorial predator, neutralized, and that was where he'd left it. He thought about it now. He thought about the way it had looked at him. He pressed both palms flat on the table and stared at the map until Raid came in with the evening reports. And what Raid said next erased every thought of the wolf from his mind for 3 full days. "Warlord Vreth has moved his eastern line forward by 40 kilometers, Raid said, setting the writer's message flat on the table beside the map. "He hit 2 of our outposts at the Grand River crossing, both gone. 30 soldiers dead." Kaelin read the message without picking it up. He knew which outposts. "He hit them in the windows between our shift rotations." "That information is not public." He looked up. He knew the schedules. Raid's expression was controlled, but not entirely. "Yes, my king." "How?" The question landed in the room like a thrown blade. Raid didn't answer it because neither of them had an answer, and not having answers was the kind of failure Kaelin had never learned to carry well. It made his skin feel too tight. It made the cold in the war room feel intentional. "Double every rotation," Kaelin said. "I want the intelligence breach found. Anyone who had access to those shift schedules, I want their movements for the last 30 days on my desk by morning. Yes, sir. And raid. My king. Send a rider north. I want to know if anyone has been inside the sacred boundary territory. Anyone at all, not just our scouts. He looked back at the map. Anything that shouldn't be there. He said it like it was a tactical decision. He told himself it was. Lyra found the second chamber on the 5th day. It was behind the door in the far wall, and it had taken her 3 days of steady excavation work to clear enough of the blocked passage to squeeze through sideways with the lamp held above her head. The floor of the passage was carved in continuous text, the same layered script from the outer chamber but denser here, and she had to step carefully to avoid treading on it. The inner chamber was roughly circular, perhaps 8 meters across, with a domed ceiling that had held remarkably well given the age of the structure. On the far wall, a long ledge of stone held what she had been expecting, or what she might have expected if she had been willing to fully assemble the implications of what she'd already found. Documents, rolled tight, sealed in some kind of hardened sap that had protected them from the moisture and the centuries. 7 of them, stacked horizontally, with carved spacers between them to prevent pressure damage, as if whoever had put them here had planned for the long wait. She picked up the first one carefully, pressed her thumbnail against the seal, and felt the sap crack along its aged edge. The scroll inside was fragile but intact. She read for a long time. When she stopped, the lamp had burned low enough to throw shadows up the walls rather than light, and her hands were very steady, which meant something in her had already begun accepting what she was reading before her mind finished processing it. The scroll was a record, a lineage. The founding king of Valor had 2 bloodlines, the public one, the Iron Line, the one that became the current throne, and a second one, older, tied to the pre-conquest territory. The second line had been sealed away after the conquest, its existence expunged from official record, its last bearers sent to the border settlements with new names and the instruction to disappear. The records in her mother's papers were referenced by designation on the 4th page. She sat on the floor of the inner chamber and looked at the wall and thought about Sable standing at the boundary marker for 24 years. Thought about the way the wolf had always positioned herself, not between Lyra and threats, but between Lyra and the direction of the palace, as if the threat had always come from that direction, as if Sable had known exactly what to keep between herself and that iron throne. She thought about the royal bolt in her pack. She thought about the king who had shot her wolf. And then she thought about Vreth, the warlord who had been circling Valor's eastern edge for 3 years, whose movements and strikes had grown more precise and better informed with each passing season, as if someone had been feeding him the exact shape of the kingdom's weaknesses. Someone who needed the throne vulnerable. Someone who would benefit from the chaos of a kingdom without secure defenses. Someone who needed one specific thing cleared from the board before he moved. Her hands were still steady. She rolled the scroll closed and pressed it back into its seal, and sat in the dying lamplight, and thought about what it meant that Sable was dead, that the boundary was now unguarded, that she was sitting in a chamber that contained the only surviving proof of what she was, and that the man who had killed her wolf didn't know any of it. She didn't know if she was going to tell him. She didn't know yet what use a king was to her, or what use she was to a kingdom that had spent a century pretending people like her didn't exist. She picked up the lamp. She stood up. She was going to need to find out. On the night Lyra began the 3-day walk toward the capital, Kaelin was sitting alone in the war room at the 2nd hour past midnight when the door opened without a knock and the messenger came in with the rider's report from the northern border. Kaelin read it standing up, which was how he read everything urgent. The scout team's updated report. Tracks in the sacred boundary territory moving northeast. Single person, light boots, familiar with the terrain. The tracks predated the scout team's sweep, which meant whoever it was had been inside the boundary before his men had even been dispatched. The tracks led toward the old ruins. He read the line twice. Then he read the next line. Attached to this report, by order of Border Watcher Drent, who has observed movements at this location for 12 months, one recorded instance of a silver wolf exiting the boundary territory toward the settlement edge, behavior consistent with protective circling. Kaelin set the report flat on the table. The Silver Wolf, the ruins, the scout team that had found nothing, and the tracks of someone who had been there before them. He looked at the map. He looked at the line marking the sacred boundary. He looked at the 40-kilometer forward push from Vreth's eastern line, and the outpost attack timed to the exact shift rotation schedules that should have been known to no one outside his own war council. The wolf hadn't been guarding territory. It had been guarding something specific, and he had killed it, and now 3 days later his eastern defenses had a hole in them that someone who knew too much had driven a war column through. The cold in the room was very precise and very still, and Kaelin stood in the middle of it and felt, for the first time in 20 years, the specific quality of a mistake that couldn't be taken back. He had spent his whole life building certainty against that feeling. He had shot the wolf because he didn't tolerate things he couldn't explain, and the inability to tolerate the unexplained had been, until this moment, a strength. He picked up the bolt of parchment. He set it back down. He crossed to the door and opened it and said to the guard outside, "Find me whoever the wolf belonged to." The guard blinked. "My king?" "The Silver Wolf, from the boundary, the one I shot on the hunt." He said it without softening it. He didn't soften things. "It was bonded." "That's not a wild animal's behavior. It belonged to someone. Find them." "And if we find them, my king, what are your orders?" Kaelin looked at the map one more time over his shoulder, at the boundary line and the eastern wound in his kingdom's side, and thought about what it meant that the ruins existed and someone had known where to look. "Bring them to me," he said. "Alive and unhurt." He paused. "Tell them—" He stopped, reformulated. "Tell them the king requests an audience." The word felt strange in his mouth, not a word he used often. "Tell them it is urgent." He closed the door. Outside the window, the northern road was dark under a moonless sky, and somewhere on it, though he did not know this yet, could not have known it, Lyra Ashthorne was already walking toward him with 7 ancient scrolls in her pack, a royal bolt she had not thrown away, and 24 years of grief sharpening itself into something a great deal more dangerous than anger. She wasn't coming to ask for justice. She was coming because she had read what was in that chamber, and she understood now that the kingdom standing between her and Vreth's advance was the same kingdom that had taken the only guardian she had ever known. And she had not yet decided what she was going to do about either of those facts. The rider caught up with Lyra on the second morning. She heard the horse before she saw it, single mount, moving fast on the north road, no attempt at quiet, which meant either carelessness or a message that needed to arrive before she changed her mind about the direction she was walking. She stepped off the road into the pine shadow and waited, one hand resting loose at her side near the short blade she carried more out of habit than hope. The rider pulled up hard when he saw her standing there. Young. Couldn't have been more than 20. Royal insignia on the chest plate, but the face underneath the helmet was still soft enough to show exactly how far out of his comfort he was riding alone on the northern road in winter. "Lyra Ashthorne," he said, and it came out slightly too loud, the way people said things when they were trying to sound certain. "Who's asking?" "By order of Alpha King Kaelin of Valor," he started. "I heard you the first time." She hadn't moved out of the shadow. "What does he want?" The rider swallowed. "His Majesty requests an audience. The matter is described as urgent." She looked at him for a long moment. He was working hard to hold her gaze and not quite managing it, his eyes sliding to the tree line and back. She had that effect on people sometimes, and she had never worked out if it was something she did or something she was, some quality that came from 24 years of living at the edge of things that were supposed to be avoided. "Requests," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "Tell me what word he actually used." The rider's mouth opened, closed. He was too honest for his own good, which was the only thing that saved him from her walking away right there. He said to tell you the king requests, but the way he said it—" He stopped. "The way he said it. It didn't sound like a request, ma'am." She almost smiled, not quite. "No, I don't imagine it did." She walked back onto the road and looked up at him. He was still mounted, which put him at an advantage he didn't know how to use. He was waiting for her to follow, and she was going to, but she was going to do it on her own terms and at her own pace, and she needed him to understand that before they covered a single step together. "I'm going to the capital," she said. "I was already going, so you can ride ahead and tell your king that Lyra Ashthorne is on her way, and she'll arrive when she arrives. Or you can ride alongside me and not talk. Those are the choices available to you." He chose to ride alongside her. He did not talk. Awesome. Kaelin met her in the war room rather than the throne hall, which she noted. The throne hall was theater. The war room was where he actually thought, and meeting her there was either a calculated choice or an instinctive one, and she couldn't tell yet which was more dangerous. He was standing at the table when she came in, both hands flat on the map, and he looked up without straightening, which meant he'd decided she wasn't someone he needed to perform authority for. That was interesting. She filed it. He was bigger than she'd expected. The stories that filtered down to the border settlements described Kaelin in terms of his decisions: the Iron Levy, the conscription rolls, the border taxation that had stripped 3 villages down to subsistence. And she had built an image from those pieces that was more symbol than man. The actual person standing across the oak table from her was broader and older and had shadows under his eyes that no one had put there recently. He looked at the pack on her back and then at her face. "You were already coming," he said. "Yes." "Before my rider found you." "Before your rider found me." He absorbed that without reacting visibly, which told her he was good at absorbing things he didn't expect. He pushed back from the table and straightened. "I owe you," he started. "Don't." Her voice came out flat, no heat in it, which was more controlled than she'd felt inside. "Don't start with what you owe me. Start with why you shot her." The room settled into a particular quality of silence. Raid, standing near the far wall, had gone still in the way men went still when they were deciding whether to intervene in something that hadn't become a crisis yet. Kaelin did not look away from her. "I shot her because she was at the boundary line and she didn't run." "She didn't run because she wasn't a threat." "I didn't know that." "You didn't ask." "You don't ask a wolf." The words landed flat and honest, and that was almost worse than if he'd tried to excuse himself. He wasn't defending the decision as right. He was describing it as the only calculation he had made at the time, and the accuracy of that description made her hands curl at her sides for one brief second before she controlled them. "No," she said. "You don't. You just shoot." He held her gaze. "Yes." She pulled the bolt from her pack and set it on the map between them, royal insignia up. He looked at it. He didn't touch it. "I kept it," she said, "because I needed to know who sent it. Now I know. And I need you to know something in return." She reached back into the pack and pulled out the first scroll, not all 7, not yet, and set it beside the bolt. "This came from the ruins inside the sacred boundary territory, the site your wolf was guarding." "She wasn't my wolf." "No," Lyra said. "She was mine." She pressed her fingertip against the scroll. "Open it." He did. He unrolled it carefully, which she hadn't expected. She'd thought he would be rough with things that didn't belong to him, and read without speaking. His eyes moved across the text with the focused stillness of someone who had learned to read in conditions where distraction meant death. She watched his face. The muscle at the corner of his jaw was the only thing that moved. He rolled the scroll closed. "Where did you find this?" he said. "Under a hill that's been inside your sacred boundary for 100 years. The chamber has 7 of them. That's the first." She pulled the second scroll from the pack and set it beside the first. The second one names the settlement locations, the border settlements, where the second bloodline was sent to disappear. She paused. "Including my mother's family." The silence in the room changed quality. Raid had stopped pretending to be furniture. He was watching the king the way a man watched a cliff edge in uncertain weather. Kaelin set both hands on the table and looked at the 2 scrolls side by side. His breathing was controlled but not slow. She could see the slight expansion of his chest, the tempo slightly elevated. He was processing damage. She recognized it because she'd been doing it for 6 days. "If this is real," he said, "it's real." "I'm not questioning." He stopped. Started again with less edge. "If this is real, then Vreth knows." She had expected to be the one to say that. She had walked 3 days rehearsing how she would say it, how she would present the connection between the warlord's eastern advance and the precision of the timing. 4 days after Sable died, after 24 years of the boundary being held. She had prepared for the argument. She had not prepared for him to already be there. "How long have you known about Vreth's intelligence breach?" she said. 4 days. 4 days. The same night. He paused. He was not going to say the same night I sent for you, because that would be admitting something about causality that he wasn't ready to admit out loud. The same night the Eastern Outpost reports came in. His men hit 2 positions in the exact rotation gap. That information was inside this building. He looked at her steadily. "Someone in my council has been feeding him." Lyra thought about the chamber beneath the ruins, about the scroll that mapped which specific border families had been relocated and where, and the secondary notation, added in a different hand much later, perhaps 50 years after the first writing, that listed the palace positions held by men whose grandfathers had been part of the original concealment. She pulled the 4th scroll. "Look at the secondary notation. Halfway down, left margin." He leaned forward and read. She watched him read. "That's..." He looked up. "That's 3 of my council seats, those family names. Descendants of the men who buried the original bloodline records," she said, "whose continued position depends on those records staying buried." She held his gaze. "One of those 3 has been giving Vreth exactly what he needs. Because if Vreth takes the throne, the old records become irrelevant." He said it slowly, like a man walking uncertain ground. "Vreth takes everything, rewrites the title. There's no second bloodline to threaten any arrangement. And no inconvenient founding documents to contradict whoever ends up on top." He straightened. He looked at the bolt and the scrolls, and then passed them at the map, at the eastern line, where Vreth's advance had cut into Valor's territory, like something that had been waiting for exactly the right moment. "You came here knowing all of this," he said. "I came here because I read what was in that chamber, and I understood that whatever I am doesn't matter if the kingdom falls. There's nothing to reclaim from rubble." She heard the flatness in her own voice and didn't try to warm it. "That's not loyalty to you, that's arithmetic." Something moved in his expression. It wasn't gratitude. It was closer to recognition, the look of a man who understood the language of survival stripped of sentiment because he had been speaking it his whole life. "Raid," he said without turning. "My king. Council session tomorrow, first light. All 7 seats present, no advance notice of the agenda." He finally picked up the bolt and held it for a moment, looking at the insignia. "Send the order tonight." "Sir." Raid moved for the door and stopped when Caitlin spoke again. "And have a room prepared in the east wing. Our guest stays inside the walls tonight." Lyra said, "I didn't agree to that." "No," Caitlin said. "You didn't." He set the bolt back on the table between them. "But there's someone in this building who's been giving Vreth precise intelligence, and you just walked in here carrying the only evidence of who they might be and why. You're either the safest person in Valor right now because you're useful to me, or the most dangerous target in the capital." He looked at her without softening it. "Which one depends on whether that leak gets to Vreth before morning." She held his gaze and did her own calculation. He wasn't wrong. That was the problem with him, she was beginning to understand. He made calculations that weren't wrong, with information that was incomplete, and the gap between his math and the full truth of a situation was exactly the width of every wrong decision he had ever made. He had looked at Sable with incomplete information and shot her because the calculation said threat. He was looking at Lyra now with slightly better information, and the calculation said asset. She didn't know yet what she was going to do with the fact that he was right for the wrong reasons. "One night," she said. "However long it takes." "One night. And I keep the scrolls." He looked at the scrolls on the table. She watched him want to say no, watched him run the calculation of whether forcing the issue would cost him more than conceding it. She kept her face neutral and waited. "You keep the scrolls," he said. She gathered them, rolled them back, returned them to the pack. She slung the pack over her shoulder and met his eyes one last time before she turned for the door. "The Silver Wolf's name was Sable," she said. "She had a name." He didn't answer. She walked out. Bitikat. The East Wing room was clean and cold and overlooked the inner courtyard. Lyra sat on the edge of the bed with the pack in her lap and listened to the sounds of the palace settling around her. Footsteps on stone, the distant exchange of a guard rotation, somewhere below a door that needed its hinges oiled. She had not told him about the seventh scroll. The seventh scroll was the one she hadn't been ready to lay on a table in a room where she didn't control the exits. It was the one that contained the succession notation, the specific language about what happened if the second bloodline were ever presented with documented proof of their lineage before a full council assembly. She pressed her palm flat against the pack and stared at the wall. Outside, the capital was quiet under a sky that had turned the particular deep gray of winter that came just before snow. And in the morning, Kaelin would call his 7 council seats together without telling them why. And somewhere in those 7 seats was a person who had already decided that Lyra Ashthorne should not live long enough to reach that room. She had one night to figure out which one. And somewhere on the eastern road, Vreth was already moving. She found the traitor before dawn. Not through cleverness. Through the oldest method available to someone who had spent 24 years watching a wolf watch the world. She stayed awake, stayed quiet, and waited for the palace to show her what it was. The east wing overlooked the inner courtyard, and from the window ledge she had a sight line to the secondary gate that connected the residential quarter to the administrative corridor. At the second hour past midnight, she watched a figure cross that courtyard with a lamp held low and a gate that was trying too hard to be casual. The figure moved like someone who had made this crossing before and knew they shouldn't be seen making it. She couldn't see the face from this angle and this dark, but she could see the build, the particular set of the shoulders, and the direction the figure was heading. Not toward the barracks, not toward the kitchens, but toward the east postern where the palace wall thinned and the guard rotation, as she had already observed, ran 12 minutes between passes. She had the pack on her back and the blade at her hip before the figure reached the gate. But she didn't catch him outside the wall. She caught him coming back in. Council Lord Davan, third seat on Kaelin's war council, with a sealed letter tucked inside his coat and cold mud on his boots, from a road that had no business being on the route between the postern gate and his own residential quarter. He nearly walked into her in the shadow of the inner corridor, and the way he stopped, body locking up, one hand moving toward his belt before he registered who she was, told her everything the mud had not already confirmed. He was 50, silver-haired, with the kind of broad, deliberate face that projected trustworthiness, the way a painted sign projected whatever the painter had been paid to write. She had looked at him across the war room table 3 hours ago when Raid had brought the council notification to Kaelin's door, and she had noted him the way she noted all of them, collecting detail, reserving judgment. She had found his family name in the fourth scroll's secondary notation. Davan, descendants of the original concealment, 3 generations of council seats held by men whose position depended on certain documents staying buried. He looked at her standing in the corridor and understood immediately that she knew. She could see him understand it. The face that projected trustworthiness went through a series of very small adjustments and came out the other side as something older and a great deal colder. "You have mud on your boots," she said. "I couldn't sleep," he said. "I walked the inner garden." "The inner garden is stone." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "You're the wolf girl from the border. I'm the woman standing between you and your quarters. Move." "Who did you send the letter to?" His eyes went to the corridor behind her, calculating the distance to the guard post and whether calling for help would save him or finish him. She watched him work it out, that calling a guard brought Kaelin into the room, and Kaelin coming into the room with mud-booted Davan and the wolf girl from the border would be a conversation Davan couldn't survive. "You have no authority here," he said instead. "No," she agreed. "I have something worse. I have the fourth scroll." The cold in his face went several degrees colder. Beneath it she could see something she recognized, the specific fear of a person who had maintained a careful arrangement for a very long time and could feel the whole structure tilting. She had felt something like it in the chamber under the ruins, when she had read far enough into the scrolls to understand what she was sitting in the middle of. And the thing she had learned from that feeling was that it did not make a person reconsider. It made a person accelerate. She read that in his face and stepped back a half-second before he moved. He was faster than a 50-year-old council lord had any right to be, which meant he had been a great deal more than a council lord for a very long time. He went for her arm rather than the blade at her hip, trying to control rather than wound, which told her he still wanted this quiet. And she let him get close enough to commit to the movement before she turned inside it and drove her elbow back into his ribs with the full weight of her shoulder behind it. He hit the corridor wall, and she had the blade out and the letter out of his coat in the same motion, backing to clear distance, breathing hard through her nose. He stood against the wall with one hand pressed to his ribs and looked at her with an expression she had not seen on a man's face since the last winter her father was alive. The look of someone who had run the calculations and found that all of them ended the same way. "You'll never leave this palace," he said. "Whatever you think you have." "I have 7 scrolls and a letter you just handed me," she said. "Go back to your room. Don't speak to anyone." "Or what?" "Or I wake the king right now instead of waiting for morning." She held his gaze. "Do you want to be in front of him tonight while he's still angry, or in the council chamber tomorrow where there are rules about what he can do to you in public?" She paused. "Think carefully. That's the only choice you have left." He went back to his room. She stood in the corridor until she heard his door close, and then she leaned against the wall and let herself shake for exactly 10 seconds. Because the body didn't care about composure, the body kept its own accounts, and she had been running on compressed dread for 6 days, and it was going to come out somewhere. 10 seconds. Then she straightened and walked to Kalen's door and knocked twice, hard. He was already awake. He opened the door himself, which surprised her, and he was in working clothes rather than nightwear, which told her he hadn't slept either. He looked at the letter in her hand and then at her face, and stepped back to let her in without asking. She told him what she had seen and what she had found and what had happened in the corridor. She told it the way she told everything, in order, without embellishment, letting the facts do whatever damage they were going to do. He stood near the window and listened without interrupting, which she was beginning to understand was how he processed information he didn't want to be true. When she was done, she set the letter on the table. He picked it up. "Read it." Set it back down very carefully, the way people set down things they wanted to throw. "It's in cipher," she said, "but the addressee line isn't." The addressee line read, "Breath in a hand that matched 3 annotations in the 4th scroll." Devon's own hand, she was now certain. He had been one of the original notators, or his grandfather had been, and the work had passed down the same way the council seat had. Kalen stood very still with his hands flat on the table. She had watched him do this before, in the war room with the Eastern Outpost reports, and again when she had laid the scrolls in front of him. He went still the way a man went still, when the ground under him had just shifted and he was assessing whether it would hold. Most people flinched or moved when the world changed under them. He used stillness as a tool, a way of making the universe wait while he caught up to it. It was effective, and it was also, she thought, the habit of a man who had never fully trusted that the ground would hold, so he had learned to treat every surface as provisional. "He's been in that seat for 11 years, Kalen said. "Yes." "He was in the room for every strategic discussion we've had about the eastern border." "Yes." He looked up. "The shift rotation schedules that Vreth used to hit the outposts were from a meeting Davon attended," she said. "I read the notation in the 2nd scroll. His family has been the primary maintenance contact for the concealment since the original burial. That means a century of practice at being trusted and being something else entirely underneath it." Something moved in his expression that was not quite anger, so it was underneath anger, older than anger, the bedrock that anger was built on. She had seen it in the mirror often enough to recognize it. "Wake Raid," he said. "Tell him Davan is confined to quarters. 2 guards on his door, no communication, no visitors." He pulled the letter toward him and looked at it again. "We accelerate the council session to first light. Not all 7 seats. I want the 3 names from your scroll separated before any of them knows the others have been summoned." "That's the right move," she said, and then heard herself say it and understood why he looked up sharply. "You're advising me now," he said. Not accusatory, noting. "I'm agreeing with you. There's a difference." "Is there?" She picked up her pack. "I'll wake Raid." "Lyra." She stopped. He had used her name twice now, both times without apparent decision, the way people use names when they had forgotten to be careful. She didn't turn around immediately. She filed the fact away and counted 2 breaths before she turned, because she had learned that the response you gave to unexpected things before you'd had time to think was often the truest one, and she was not ready to be that honest in this room. "The 7th scroll," he said. "You haven't shown it to me." She looked at him across the war room in the low lamplight, the letter between them, the bolt still somewhere on this table under the map's edge, Sable's name hanging in the air between them like something neither of them had agreed to carry. "No," she said. "I haven't." "Is it relevant to what happens tomorrow?" "Not yet." He held her gaze and she held his, and the silence between them was the particular quality of a silence between 2 people who are both withholding something and both know it and have reached an impasse that neither of them is going to resolve tonight. "First light," he said. "First light," she confirmed. She went to wake Raid. The council session broke open before it officially began. Lord Davon was not in his quarters when the guards went to collect him at first light. His room was empty, his personal seal broken on the interior document chest. He had destroyed something before he left, and the east postern gate was unlatched from the inside. He had been awake and ready and moving before Kalen's order had even reached the guard post. Someone had told him. Lyra was standing in the war room when Raid brought the news in, and she watched Kalen receive it with the same external stillness she had catalogued 3 times now, and she thought, this is what it costs him. Not the anger he showed the room. The stillness was what it cost him, the tremendous effort of not letting the ground shift visibly under his feet when everything had already changed underneath. He had help, Kalen said. Had to, Raid said. He couldn't have known about the confinement order unless someone in this building told him. Kalen looked at the other 6 council summons still sitting on the table, undelivered. Which means Davan is not the only one. The room absorbed that. Lyra thought about the letter in cipher, about the 100-year maintenance of a secret that had required multiple hands in multiple generations. She thought about the 4th scroll's secondary notation and the 3 family names listed there, and she thought about the fact that she had told Kalen which 3 they were last night, and she thought about who else might have been close enough to a corridor or a door to hear that conversation. Raid, she said. Both men looked at her. She picked up the quill from the table and wrote the 2nd and 3rd family names from the scroll notation on the blank edge of the map. She turned it to face Kalen. He looked at the names. He looked at Raid. Raid looked at the names. Corvin, Kalen said very quietly, reading the first name she had written. Raid's jaw locked. Raid, Kalen said. My family name is Raid, the commander said with a precise and terrible flatness. Not Corvin. No, Kalen said, but Corvin is your mother's name. The war room went to silence so complete that Lyra could hear the lamp burning. Raid stood at attention in the middle of the room with his hands at his sides and his face doing nothing at all. No flinch, no protest, no color change. Just the absolute stillness of a man who had known this moment was coming from the second he walked in the door and had spent the intervening minutes deciding how to stand when it arrived. How long? Kalen said. Raid said nothing. Raid. His voice had dropped to the register that wasn't loud and wasn't quiet, the one that had no performance in it at all. How long? Since before your father died, Raid said. The answer was so much worse than Kalen had been braced for that Lyra saw it hit him the way a physical thing hits, absorbed through the chest rather than processed through the mind, the body getting there first. He had trusted Raid the length of his entire reign, longer. Raid had been the one constant in a court full of people who changed their loyalties with the wind, and Lyra watched Kalen understand in real time that the constant had been a performance, and underneath it was 100 years of arranged betrayal waiting for exactly the right warlord to arrive at the eastern border. You told him about the shift rotations, Kalen said. Yes. You told Davon about the confinement order last night. Yes. You've been in every strategic meeting I've ever conducted. Yes. Each admission landed flat and identical, and she thought she understood why Raid was giving them that way. Not contrition, not defiance. Just the accounting of a man settling his debts before the final number came due. Was any of it real? Kalen said. Any of it. The first crack in Raid's composure was very small and very brief, a tension around the eyes, gone in a breath. "That's not a useful question," Raid said. "No," Kalen agreed, "it isn't." He crossed to the door, opened it, and said to the guards outside, "Commander Raid is confined, full restraint, no communication." He did not raise his voice. He did not have to. When he turned back to the room, Lyra was standing with the seventh scroll open on the table. She had taken it out while he was at the door. She had made the decision not in a moment of calculation, but in the specific recognition of what the room had just become. A place where the old structure of trust had been stripped to the foundation in the space of 60 seconds, and what filled that space next would either be something they built together, or something Vreth walked into unopposed. He looked at the scroll. He looked at her. "Read it," she said. He crossed back to the table and read. She watched his eyes move through the succession notation, through the language about documented lineage and council assembly, through the specific clause about what the founding charter required in the event of a verified second bloodline, claimant presented with full record before a sitting council. He read it twice. Then he looked up. "This gives you the throne," he said. "It gives me standing before the council," she said. "It isn't the same thing. It's close enough that Vreth has spent 100 years making sure no one found these documents." "Yes." He looked at her steadily. Outside, the sounds of the palace were beginning to shift into morning activity. Guards changing, kitchen fires starting, a kingdom running on its routines without knowing yet that something under its foundations had just given way. "You could have shown me this last night," he said. "I could have," she said. "I didn't know yet whether you were someone I could show it to. And now." She looked at him across the scroll, across Raid's empty space in the room, across the bolt that was still under the map's edge, across 6 days of grief and calculation and the specific exhaustion of being right about things that cost everything. "Now Vreth is moving east," she said, "and the only 2 people in this palace who aren't compromised are standing in this room, and we have maybe 3 days before his advance column reaches the outer wall." She put her hand flat on the 7th scroll. "So now we don't have the luxury of deciding whether we trust each other. We only get to decide what we do with the time we have." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I need to know what you want." It was the first time he had asked her that directly, the first time he had framed it as her wanting something that he was obligated to account for, rather than as a problem to be solved or an asset to be positioned. She felt the difference and did not let herself react to it, because reacting to it would cost her something she couldn't afford to spend yet. "I want Vreth stopped," she said. "I want the scrolls made public, and I want Sable's name in whatever record comes out of this, so that someone 100 years from now knows there was a silver wolf who stood at a boundary line for 2.5 decades and held a secret that was worth holding." He absorbed that. He did not look away. "All right," he said. Outside, the first snow of winter had begun to fall on the capital, and somewhere on the eastern road, Vreth's advance column was already within 2 days of the outer wall. And in the war room of a palace that had just lost its commander and its oldest council seat in the space of a single night, the Alpha King of Valor and the last heir of a buried bloodline looked at each other across a table covered in evidence of everything that had gone wrong, and began to plan. They had 2 days and a broken war council and exactly one advantage that Vreth did not know about yet. Lyra spread the 6th scroll flat on the war room table and held the edges down with the lamp and the bolt, while Kalen stood across from her and they both studied the map of the underground passage system that the original builders of the palace had seen fit not to include in any official record. The passages ran beneath the capital's inner wall in a network that connected the old foundation chambers to 3 exit points outside the city boundary. 2 of them collapsed, the 3rd potentially intact, depending on how accurately the scroll's survey markings corresponded to current geography. "If the 3rd passage holds," she said, "it exits 200 meters north of the eastern gate, outside Vreth's projected advance line. If it holds, the scroll is accurate on the first 2 chambers. I've been in them." He looked at her across the map. "You've been in the palace foundation chambers." "I've been in the ruin system that connects to them. It took me 3 years to map the overlap." She traced the line with her finger. "Sable used to rest on the ground directly above this junction point. I thought she was choosing the warmth from the stone, She was marking it. He was quiet for a moment, processing. She had watched him learn to do this over the course of 3 days, absorb new information about the wolf without deflecting it, let the full weight of what he had not known sit in the room alongside what he did. If we can get a unit through that passage before Vreth's column reaches the eastern gate, he said, we come out behind his line. Small unit. The passage won't accommodate more than 4 abreast. Doesn't need to be large. Needs to be the right people. He straightened. I'll go. I know. You'll stay. I know the passage. You don't. She met his eyes. You need me in the front. He held her gaze for the count of 4 slow breaths, and she watched him run the calculation the same way she'd watched him run every calculation since the first night, rapidly, precisely, and with the particular restraint of a man who had learned that the right answer and the answer he wanted were rarely the same thing. 4 people total, he said. You, me, and 2 soldiers I choose personally. No one else knows the route until we're in the passage. Agreed. And you tell me everything about what's in those foundation chambers before we go in. Everything. She held his gaze. Everything, she said. She told him. The advance came a day early. Vreth's column hit the outer eastern wall at the 3rd hour past midnight on the 2nd day, and the alarm bells were still climbing to full voice when Kaelin came through the door of her room, already in armor with blood on his left forearm from a cut she hadn't seen happen. He accelerated, he said. She was already dressed. She had slept in her clothes for 2 days. Devon reached him. Has to be. He crossed to the window and looked at the eastern sky where the first fire was already showing orange above the wall line. We move now, the passage, or we lose the window. She grabbed the pack. They went down. The 2 soldiers Kaelin had chosen were named Voss and Thresh, both compact, both quiet, both wearing the look of people who understood they had been selected for a mission that had a high probability of being the last one they went on, and had decided that was acceptable. Voss was a woman of about 35, with a lateral scar across her chin and eyes that moved constantly in the careful professional manner of someone who had survived by never letting anything come from a direction she hadn't already checked. Thresh was younger, maybe 25, and radiated the specific controlled energy of a person who had learned to convert fear into forward motion. They met in the cellar below the East Wing kitchen, where the original foundation stones were old enough to show the pre-conquest construction in the quality of the cut. Lyra found the seam in the floor by feel. She had been over this map enough times to carry it in her hands, and Kaelin helped her shift the covering stone without being asked. Cold air came up from below. Old cold, the deep-buried kind that tasted like stone and time and nothing biological. Single file, Lyra said. Lamp stays behind me. If I stop, everyone stops. No questions, no debate. She looked at Kaelin specifically when she said the last part. He said nothing, which was the most she could have hoped for. They went down. The passage was intact. The first 200 meters were low. She had to duck her head, and Kaelin, broader and taller, moved with his shoulders angled and his jaw set against what that cost him physically. The stone was wet in places, groundwater seeping through old cracks, and twice the floor dropped unexpectedly, and she caught herself with her palm flat on the wall and heard the others adjust behind her. No one spoke. The lamp threw a circle of yellow light that was just barely enough to navigate by, and beyond its edge the passage was complete darkness in both directions, the kind of darkness that pressed back. She thought about Sable lying above this passage for 24 years. Patient, still, watching the boundary. She thought about what it took to hold a post for that length of time with nothing but the knowledge that the post needed holding. No reward, no recognition, no one who even understood what you were doing. She thought that was the loneliest kind of courage, and also the most durable. The third junction was where the scroll had shown the collapse risk. She stopped at it and held the lamp high and studied the ceiling stones while the others waited behind her in silence. Well, Kaelin said, very quiet. Holding, she said. Move fast through this section. Don't touch the right wall. They moved fast. The ceiling held. The exit was a hatch set into the underside of a drainage outcrop 212 meters north of the eastern gate, exactly where the scroll had marked it. Lyra had to work the mechanism by feel alone in the dark, a recessed lever corroded with age and soil. And when it finally gave, the cold night air came down around them like something released from a long wait. She pushed up through the hatch and came out into a shallow depression in the frozen ground. The eastern wall was visible from here, torchlit and loud with the sounds of Vreth's first assault. She could hear it clearly now, the percussion of it, siege equipment and shouted orders, and underneath all of it, the particular sound a wall made when it was being tested for the first time. Kaelin came up beside her and surveyed the ground without speaking. 200 meters of open field between their position and Vreth's rear line. The advance column was concentrated against the eastern gate, which meant their flank was thinner. Men positioned to prevent a sortie from inside the wall, not to watch for anything coming up behind them. She counted 9 rearguard positions. Torches spread in an arc. 3 gaps, she said quietly, nodding to the dark spaces between the torch positions. The center gap is widest. If we move on the ground without torches, we can reach the rear command position before they have time to consolidate. Command position, Kaelin said. Vreth runs his field operations from behind the line. He'll be there. She looked at Kaelin. You know that's what this is? I know. Not the army, him. I know, Lyra. She heard her name in his mouth and felt the particular weight of a person saying something they had chosen to say, rather than something that had slipped out. And she filed it the same way she had filed all the other instances and kept her eyes on the field. Voss, Thresh, Kaelin said. You hold the center gap, no one through in either direction. You see Vreth's rear guard consolidate. You signal and fall back to the hatch. He paused. Don't wait for us. Thresh said, Sir, that's an order. Thresh and Voss exchanged a look that said volumes and then said nothing. Voss checked the blade at her hip and nodded once. They went in. The center gap was 40 meters across, and they crossed it in a low run that cost Lyra every bit of composure she had, the frozen ground uneven under her boots, the torchlight at the edges of her vision throwing moving shadows that her nervous system kept reading as figures turning to look. Her breath came hard through her nose, and her heart was doing something loud and irregular in her chest, and she kept her eyes on the dark ahead and did not look at the flanks. Kaelin moved beside her and slightly ahead, which she registered without the energy to be irritated by. They reached the rear line. The command position was set up in a shallow natural depression behind the advance, the kind of positioning that offered sight lines forward and a natural barrier on the rear, competent, professional, exactly what she had expected from a warlord who had spent 3 years dismantling Valor's eastern border piece by piece. 2 fire stands for light, a field table with a map, and the man himself with 4 personal guards in a close formation. Vreth was smaller than she had imagined. They always were. The people whose decisions moved armies and shattered kingdoms tended to be ordinary-sized men who had found the specific lever that made the world tilt in their direction, and Vreth was a lean 50-something with a methodical stillness about him that reminded her, unpleasantly, of the patience she had admired in Sable. He saw them at the same moment she stepped into the firelight, and the thing that told her he had been doing this for a very long time was that he didn't reach for a weapon and he didn't shout. He looked at her, looked at Kaelin beside her, and then looked at the space where his 4 guards had been standing a moment before the 2 of them had come in low through the perimeter. 3 of the 4 guards were still standing. Kaelin had his blade out. The 4th guard was on the ground. Lyra had not seen it happen. She registered it now the way you registered things in the half-second after they occurred. The fallen body, the blood, the particular silence of the 3 remaining guards who were making the calculation of whether to move and arriving at caution, because the Alpha King of Valor was standing 6 feet from their warlord with a blade already proven and nothing in his face that looked like hesitation. Vreth's voice was measured. King Kaelin! Vreth! Kaelin moved 1 step to the right, which repositioned Vreth between himself and the fire stands, backlit. Call them off. Call off my army, Vreth said. Neutral. Almost curious. Your rear guard. The 3 men behind you. Kaelin didn't look at them. He kept his eyes on Vreth. One of them moves, and this conversation ends badly for you. Breth considered this with an expression that held no panic and very little urgency. He was a man who had been in bad corners before, and he had the stillness of someone who knew that panic cost more than it purchased. "You came through the old passage," he said. Not a question. "Yes." "The scroll system. You found the girl." He looked at Lyra with what would have been, in another context, something like professional acknowledgement. "I've been trying to locate those documents for 11 years. My men had the ruin site mapped for excavation next season." "They won't get the chance," Lyra said. He looked at her steadily. "You're the last of the founding line." "Yes." "Then you understand what you are to this kingdom is a problem more than a solution. A contested bloodline doesn't secure a throne, it splits one." "I'm not contesting anything," she said. "I'm ending yours." Vreth smiled. It was a small smile, contained, the expression of a man who had heard threatening statements from people who didn't fully understand the situation. "My army is at your eastern wall. Your war council has 2 traitors and no commander. Your king came through a hole in the ground with 1 companion and a blade." He let the silence sit a moment. "Ending my ambitions requires rather more than the 2 of you." "4, said Voss from the dark behind his right flank. Thresh from the left. "Sir?" Vreth did not turn. He absorbed the information through the small change in the 3 guards' expressions, and she watched him revise the tactical picture without letting any of it reach his face. He was very good. She gave him that. 4, Kaelin said. "And every soldier on that wall knows your supply line runs through the Grand River crossing, which is now behind us and undefended. You can press the assault. Spend 3 days cracking that gate." He tilted his head very slightly. "Or you can look at your rear and notice that we didn't come through here alone." It was a bluff. She knew it was a bluff. Voss and Thresh were the whole of it, and the supply line threat was real, but the force that would need to execute on it did not exist. Kaelin was standing in the firelight with blood on his arm and 4 people at his back, betting everything on Vreth's uncertainty. It was a reasonable calculation. She thought that, clearly, and without sentiment. The man beside her was making the only move available in a situation where the alternative was losing. What she had not anticipated was what Vreth did next. He looked past Kaelin. He looked past her. He looked at the darkness behind them toward the eastern wall, and something in his assessment shifted. Not much, not visibly, to anyone who hadn't been watching his face as carefully as she had. And he said quietly to the 3 guards behind him, "Hold." They held. "You're bluffing," Vreth said to Kaelin. "Find out," Kaelin said. The firelight moved between them. Somewhere above the wall, something struck stone, and the percussion of it rolled across the field in a low wave, and they stood in the middle of it in the field command post with the world breaking open around them, and neither of them moving first. Then Vreth's eyes moved to Lyra. Not to Kaelin, to her. "The founding charter," he said. "If those documents are authenticated before a full council, the provision is automatic. The throne goes to binding arbitration between the claimant and the current holder." He looked at her with the expression of a man doing the last calculation available to him. "That means you would have to stand in front of Kaelin's council and make the claim." "Yes," she said, "and you're willing to do that." She thought about the chamber, about Sable's name and the 7 scrolls, and the 100-year silence that had cost her mother's family everything, and cost Sable 2.5 decades of a life spent in patient watchfulness at a boundary line. She thought about what it meant to want a thing badly enough to walk 3 days in winter toward the man who had killed your last guardian, because the alternative was letting everything she had protected die with her. "Yes," she said again. Vreth looked at her for a long moment. He looked at Kaelin. He looked at the dark behind them one more time, and she saw him make the final calculation, the one that weighed a contested throne against an uncertain army and an undefended supply line, and 2 blades already in the firelight, and arrived at the only conclusion a pragmatic man arrived at when the arithmetic stopped favoring him. He was going to say something. She saw him open his mouth, and then the eastern wall erupted. Not fell, erupted, the sound of it massive and immediate, a section of the upper battlement giving way in a cascade of stone and fire that turned the sky above the capital orange and white and sent a shockwave of displaced air across the field that hit them all like a physical push. The 3 guards spun. Vreth's eyes went to the wall. His army below the breach was screaming orders. And in the half-second when everyone in the command post was looking at the wall, Vreth moved. Not toward escape. Toward her. She had underestimated him. That was the thought she had in the single second she had to have a thought, before he crossed the distance between them with the blade he had been holding along his forearm since the moment they'd walked into the firelight. Not drawn, but held, concealed. The oldest trick. And she had not seen it because she had been watching his face and his eyes, and she had missed his hands. Kaylin's shoulder hit her sideways at the same moment the blade cut the air where she had been standing. She went down hard on the frozen ground. Kaylin was between her and Vreth, absorbing the impact of a follow-through that caught him across the left side. She heard the specific sound of it, felt the way the air changed. And he didn't fall. He drove forward into Vreth's guard space instead. The way a man drove forward when falling back was not a thing he knew how to do. Lyra rolled to her feet. She had the bolt, not her blade. The bolt, the royal bolt she had been carrying in her pack for 10 days. The one she had pulled from Sable's body and cleaned and kept without fully knowing why until this exact moment when she found it in her hand because her hand had made the decision before she had. She looked at Vreth and Kaylin, locked together in the firelight. Kaylin bleeding from the left side and refusing to give ground. Vreth trying to create the space to use the blade again, and she thought with sudden clear precision, if she threw the bolt and missed, she hit Kaylin. She didn't miss. The bolt took Vreth in the shoulder, the same shot, she thought distantly, the same angle, and drove him sideways out of Kaylin's grip. He went down on one knee and stayed there, blade still in hand but the arm that held it no longer responding the way he needed it to. The 3 guards looked at their warlord on one knee. They looked at Kaylin standing over him with blood running freely down his left side. They looked at Lyra standing 6 feet back with an empty throwing hand and an expression that she could not see herself but which, based on the way the guard's calculation visibly changed, was communicating something adequate. Voss and Thresh had the 3 guards covered before any of them finished deciding. The field below the wall had gone from screaming to the particular chaotic uncertainty of an army whose commander has just disappeared from the rear line. And that kind of uncertainty had a lifespan measured in minutes before it became rout or rally, and which way it went depended entirely on what happened in the next 60 seconds. Kaylin stood over Vreth in the firelight, one hand pressed to his left side, breathing hard. Blood was coming through his fingers at a rate she noted and filed as serious. He looked down at Vreth. Vreth looked up at him with a face that had finally, for the first time, shown something underneath the calculation. Not fear, not quite, but the recognition of a man who had run out of contingencies. "It's over," Kaylin said. His voice was very even. It cost him something to make it that even, and she knew it. Vreth said nothing. "Call the retreat," Kaylin said. "Or I let the army on that wall come down here and we find out how the accounting ends without your orders to hold them." Vreth looked at the wall. The breach was burning. The assault below it had stalled in the confusion of a command vacuum, men looking for direction that wasn't coming. Vreth looked at Lyra. She did not look away from him, and whatever he saw in her face was the last thing he needed to see before he made his decision. He turned to the nearest of his standing guards and gave the signal. 3 specific arm movements, the field recall code, and the guard ran. The silence that followed was not peace. It was the silence of a thing that had not finished yet, but had changed direction. Kaylin's knees didn't buckle. She gave him that. But his weight shifted and she crossed to him and put her shoulder under his arm without asking, and he let her, which told her more about the state of him than the blood on his side. "How bad?" she said. "Bad enough," he said. "Not enough. I need to see it. When we're back inside the wall." She looked at the wound anyway. It was deep but clean. Vreth had been going for something lethal, and the fact that Kaylin had driven forward into him rather than back had changed the angle. A centimeter different, and it would have been a different conversation. "You stepped in front of me," she said. "Yes." "Don't do that again." He looked at her in the firelight, pale from blood loss and running on something beyond whatever normal men ran on, and said, "That's not a promise I can make." The wall burned orange above them. Vreth's army was beginning to pull back from the eastern gate. Voss and Thresh had Vreth on his feet between them, bound and upright, and the 4 personal guards had been disarmed and were kneeling in the frozen field with their hands visible. Everything had shifted. The battle was not won. She knew that, understood the difference between a tactical collapse and a finished war. But the fulcrum had moved, and what happened next would be decided not on this field, but in the council chamber, in front of the 7 remaining seats, with the 7 scrolls laid open and the founding charter's succession provision in play for the first time in 100 years. She thought about the 7th scroll, about what standing in that chamber would mean and what it would cost, and whether the version of herself that had walked out of the ruins 8 days ago was the same version that was going to have to walk into that room and say out loud what those documents said she was. Kaylin's weight against her shoulder was heavy and warm and real. "Can you walk?" she said. "Can you stop asking questions I've already answered?" She almost smiled. Not quite. They walked. They got Kaylin back through the passage and through the palace and into the hands of the physician before the eastern sky had finished deciding what color it was going to be at dawn. Lyra stood outside the physician's door for a long time. She stood there because there was nowhere else to be that made immediate sense. Voss was managing the prisoner transfer. Vreth under guard in the lower cells, his field commanders being processed through the outer gate as Vreth's army completed its organized withdrawal from the wall. Thresh had taken the scrolls under seal to a locked room in the administrative quarter at her instruction. With 2 guards she had selected herself based on no criteria other than that they had not been present for any meeting in which Raid or Davon had participated. The eastern breach in the wall was being assessed for structural damage. The capital was doing what capitals did in the aftermath of a near catastrophe, absorbing the shock in pieces, each sector finding its own rhythm again, the way a body regulated itself back toward normal after the crisis passed. She stood outside the physician's door and listened to the muffled voices inside and thought about nothing in particular, which was what her mind did when it had been running hard for too long and had finally used up everything it had. After a while, the physician came out and told her the wound was deep, but had missed the critical structures, that the blood loss was significant but controllable, and that the king would need 3 weeks of enforced rest that he was almost certainly going to resist for the entirety of those 3 weeks. "He's asking for you," the physician added, with the neutral tone of a man who had long since stopped having opinions about what kings asked for. She went in. Kaylin was propped against the headboard with his left side bandaged tight from hip to armpit, and the particular gray-white color of a person who had given a significant quantity of blood to the ground and had not yet replaced it. He looked smaller in a bed than he did in a war room. Not diminished, something more honest than that. Like the scale of a place finally matched the actual dimensions of the person in it, rather than the dimensions of the role. He looked at her when she came in, and she could see him take inventory, checking her, cataloging what was intact and what wasn't, running the same assessment she had run on him before she'd let herself notice she was doing it. "Vreth," he said. "Secured. His commanders are surrendering in stages. The army is withdrawing. The wall. Upper eastern battlement, roughly 30 feet of facing stone. Repairable." She sat in the chair beside the bed without being asked. "The kingdom is intact." He absorbed that, let out a slow breath that was not quite relief. It was deeper than relief. The exhalation of a person who had been holding something at great cost for a very long time and had finally been given permission to put it down. "The council session," he said. "Tomorrow, when you can be present." "I can be present today." "You cannot." He looked at her with the expression he used when he was deciding whether to push something, and she looked back at him with the expression she apparently used that made him decide not to, and the silence between them settled into something almost comfortable in its familiarity. "The 7th scroll," he said. "Yes. You're going to have to stand in front of what remains of that council and present it." "I know." "And you're not afraid of that." She thought about it honestly. "I'm afraid of what comes after it. The standing in front of them is just a thing that happens." She looked at her hands. "What comes after is the part that doesn't have a script." He was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the dawn had finally committed. Gray gold, thin, the kind of early winter light that didn't promise warmth but was honest about what it was. "I've been thinking," he said, about what kind of king runs a council with traitors in it for 11 years and doesn't know. The kind who built his authority on making people afraid of him, she said. Not cruel, just even. Fear makes people obedient, it doesn't make them honest. She met his eyes. You couldn't have known what Raid was because Raid never had reason to let you see it. He was afraid of you. They all were. That was the point. Yes. And it was also the hole in your armor. She held his gaze. Fear keeps people in line. It doesn't keep them loyal. He looked at the window for a long moment. The light moved across the stone floor in the slow way winter light moved, without urgency, without the pretense that it would be warm later. I know, he said. And then, after a beat, with the particular quality of a man saying something he had worked out alone in the dark, and was saying out loud for the first time, I've known for a while. She said nothing. Sometimes the most honest thing was to let a person finish arriving at what they already understood. I built what my father built, he said, because it worked, and because I understood it, and because the alternative, he stopped. The alternative required trusting people, and trusting people meant they could fail you. I'd seen what that cost. So you made sure no one was close enough to fail you. Yes. And ended up with a council full of people performing loyalty and a commander who'd been reporting to your enemy since before you took the throne. Yes. The word sat in the room without weight, without defense, just acknowledgement. She had expected it to take longer, expected more architecture around it. The justifications, the exceptions, the qualifications that powerful men built around their failures to make them livable. He didn't build any of that. He just said yes, and let the yes be the whole of it. She understood then what it cost him. Not the saying of it, the not building around it, the willingness to let the wrong thing be wrong without the scaffolding of explanation. Sable stood at that boundary for 24 years, she said, because she understood that some things were worth holding even when no one was watching and no one was going to thank you for it. She looked at him. That's not fear, that's the other thing. He looked at her for a long moment. What's the other thing? The thing that holds when fear runs out, she said. I don't have a better word for it than that. He didn't either. She could see him not having it, turning the idea over, looking at it from the angles available to a man who had built his whole architecture on something else and was only now starting to understand what had been missing in the foundation. Rest, she said, standing. The council is tomorrow. You need to be able to stand up in that room. I can stand up. You can stand up when you've slept and eaten and let that wound knit for more than 4 hours. She looked at him steadily. I'll be here in the morning. She turned for the door. Lyra. She stopped, turned halfway. He looked at her from the bed with the gray winter light on his face and the bandage white against his side, and she thought he looked like a man who had been through a thing that had changed the shape of him and hadn't yet found out what the new shape was. The wolf, he said. Sable. He said the name with the care of someone handling something they knew they had no right to and were handling anyway because the alternative was leaving it on the floor. I can't give that back. No, she said. You can't. I know. He held her gaze. I'm going to spend a long time knowing it. She looked at him for a long moment, at the honesty of that. Not an apology, not a promise that things would be different, not the performance of contrition. Just the clear-eyed acknowledgement that some things broke and stayed broken, and the person who broke them had to carry the weight of that without the comfort of resolution. Yes, she said. You are. She left him to sleep. What? The council session convened at mid-morning in the main chamber with 5 remaining seats. Devon fled, Raid in chains, the other council members present and carrying the carefully neutral expressions of people who had spent the night calculating how much they had not known and how much that ignorance could be made to look like innocence. Lyra stood at the front of the room and unrolled the 7th scroll and read the succession provision aloud. The chamber was very quiet. Kaelin stood to her left, pale but vertical, in formal council dress over the bandage side, and his presence in the room was doing something different than it usually did. She had watched him command rooms through the weight of authority and the architecture of fear. He was doing something else today. He was simply present, which was quieter, and she was beginning to understand considerably harder. When she finished reading, the council member closest to the center table, an older woman named Vesat, who had held her seat for 30 years and survived 4 political purges through a combination of genuine competence and careful silence, spoke first. "The charter provision is automatic upon documented verification," Vesat said. "That would require authentication by the council's appointed record keeper." "The record keeper is compromised," Lyra said. "Davin's family held that appointment for 3 generations." "Then an independent verification by the full council in session," Vesat said. She looked at the scroll without touching it, "which is what is occurring." The other 4 council members looked at each other and looked at the scroll and looked at Kaelin standing to Lyra's left with blood seeping slowly through the white of his formal shirt despite the physician's best work. "The provision," Vesat said carefully, "calls for binding arbitration between the claimant and the current holder. Not a transfer of power, not a removal." She looked at Lyra. "What is the claimant's position?" Lyra had thought about this for 8 days. She had thought about it in the ruins chamber, on the 3-day walk to the capital, in the East Wing room with the pack in her lap and the sound of a palace that wanted her dead moving in the walls around her. She had thought about it in the field command post with Vreth's blade in the firelight, and in the passage under the wall with the old cold pressing up through the stone, and Sable's name moving quietly through her mind like something that had not finished being said. She had thought about what she wanted, not what the scrolls required, not what Vreth had feared, not what Kaelin might offer or withhold, what she, Lyra Ashthorne, last of a buried bloodline and keeper of a wolf, who had died at a boundary she had held for 24 years, actually wanted from the world she had walked back into. "The claimant's position," she said, "is that a kingdom cannot be stable if its foundation is a lie." She looked at the council. "The founding charter is part of the public record from this point forward. The second bloodline is acknowledged. The boundary territory is reclassified as protected founding land, not sacred prohibition, and the settlements along its edge are granted formal status within the kingdom rather than ambiguous toleration." She paused. "Those are the terms of arbitration I'm prepared to accept." Vesat looked at Kaelin. "And the current holder's position." Kaelin looked at Lyra for a long moment. Not the calculating look, not the look that was running the arithmetic on risk and asset and position. Something quieter than that, and older. "Accepted," he said. The chamber absorbed it. Vesat made the notation in the official record. The other 4 members signed in order of seniority. Lyra pressed her thumb to the 7th scroll's attestation mark, and Kaelin pressed his seal beside it. And the thing that had been buried for 100 years and had cost Sable her life and cost Lyra's mother's family their name and their history and their right to exist in the open came finally into the light of a winter morning in the capital of Valhalor and lay there, documented and witnessed and true. It was quieter than she had expected. Large things usually were, when they finally happened. The imagined version always had more ceremony. Pasek. They put Sable's name in the record that afternoon. Lyra wrote it herself in the official chronicle that the council secretary maintained, in the entry for the founding boundary territory reclassification. She wrote, "The silver wolf known as Sable, bonded guardian of the Ashthorne line, who held the southern boundary of the founding territory without relief or recognition for a period of 24 years until her death, is hereby acknowledged as having performed a function of historical and territorial significance to the kingdom of Valor." She wrote it in plain language because plain language was what it deserved. It didn't need ornament. What Sable had done didn't require enhancement. Kaelin came and stood beside her while she wrote. He didn't read over her shoulder. He gave her the space of it, standing a half-step back, present without crowding. When she set down the pen, he looked at what she had written and was quiet for a moment. "It's not enough," he said. "No," she agreed. "It isn't. But it's what we have. It's what we have." He looked at the page for a long time. She watched his profile in the afternoon light, the jaw, the shadows under his eyes, the set of his mouth that had learned to hold things without letting them show, and was, she thought, in the slow process of unlearning that. Some changes happened fast, and some happened the way stone changed, imperceptibly, over time, and what was left afterward was either weathered into nothing or carved into something that had not existed before. She didn't know yet which one he was going to be. She didn't know which one she was going to be either. The border settlements, he said. I'll need someone who knows them. You'll need to go to them, she said, yourself. Not a representative, not a written order. You. She looked at him. They've been on the outside of this kingdom for 100 years. You don't close that distance with paperwork. I know. He looked at the chronicle page. Will you come? She thought about the path back north, the pine forest, the frozen ground, the place where the snow had held Sable's outline for 3 days after, before the weather finally smoothed it over. She thought about the ruins and the chamber and the door in the far wall that she had left open, the lamplight dying as she'd walked away with 7 scrolls, and the beginning of an understanding of what she was going to have to do. She thought about going back there with the record altered, with Sable's name in the chronicle, with the boundary territory reclassified and the settlements given status, and about what it would feel like to stand in the place where the wolf had fallen and know that the accounting had been done. Not complete, not resolved. Some things didn't resolve. They just became part of the foundation that everything after was built on. Yes, she said. He exhaled, not with relief, with the specific quality of a person setting down something they had been carrying at the edge of their endurance and feeling the absence of the weight more than any comfort. They stood beside the open chronicle in the afternoon light of a capital that was still standing, in a kingdom that had a hole in its eastern wall and a fracture in its council and 3 weeks of reconstruction ahead of it and 100 years of deliberate forgetting that was going to take considerably longer than 3 weeks to undo. None of it was clean. None of it was the version of resolution that had ceremony and finality and the sense of a door closing cleanly on what had been. It was the version where the door was still open and the cold still came through it, and the work of deciding what to do with the open door was just beginning. Lyra thought that was probably the only honest kind. 3 weeks later, she stood at the boundary marker in the northern forest where Sable had fallen. The snow had returned and covered everything, and there was no mark left on the ground. The weather didn't keep accounts, and the forest had gone on doing what forests did regardless of what happened in the spaces between the trees. The boundary marker stood the same as it always had, carved sigil worn almost smooth, stone darkened by decades of moisture. And the ancient trees beyond it held the same quality of silence they had always held, the kind that felt like it was listening. She stood there for a long time without speaking. Behind her, at a distance she had asked for and he had given without question, she could hear Kalen's breath in the cold, the occasional shift of his weight on the frozen ground. He had ridden north with her, and 7 of his own guard, and said almost nothing on the journey, which she was coming to understand was his version of attention. The absence of noise as a form of presence. She thought about 24 years. She thought about what it meant to hold a post that long, in the cold, with no ceremony and no witness, and no guarantee that what you were holding it for would ever matter to anyone who could tell you. She thought about the particular quality of faithfulness that didn't require acknowledgement to keep going, that ran on something internal and self-sustaining that wasn't hope exactly, but was close to it. The decision to continue, made quietly and privately, over and over again, in all the small moments that didn't make it into any record. She thought that was the thing she had been trying to find a word for, the thing that held when fear ran out. It didn't have a better name than that, and maybe it didn't need one. She crouched down and pressed her palm flat against the snow at the base of the boundary marker, the way she had pressed her palm against Sable's flank that first morning, feeling for warmth that wasn't there. The snow was cold and still and held the faint impression of her hand for a moment before the cold smoothed it over. She stayed crouched there for a while. When she stood up, Kalen had come forward without her noticing, and he was standing a few feet to her left, looking at the tree line beyond the boundary marker with the same expression he got when he was looking at something he was trying to understand without the benefit of a map. "She was right here," Lyra said. "Yes. And you didn't know what she was?" "No." She looked at his profile. "What would you have done, if you'd known?" He was quiet for a moment. Honest quiet, not evasive. She had learned to tell the difference. "I don't know," he said. "I'd like to say I would have ridden past and left it alone, but I built 20 years on the principle that I didn't leave things I couldn't explain." He looked at the boundary marker. "I would have had to be a different person." Yes, she said. I'm working on it. She looked at him standing in the cold northern forest with snow in his hair and the bandaged side still visible under the edge of his coat, and she thought about the specific distance between who someone had been and who they were in the process of becoming, and how that distance was never crossed in a single step, was never crossed at all in the sense of arriving at a destination, but was instead a thing you moved across indefinitely, the crossing itself becoming the point. She had some of that distance to cross herself. She knew that. She was not the person who had come out of those ruins 8 days ago either. Sharper in some ways, softer in others, carrying a grief that had changed shape without getting smaller, and something new underneath the grief that she didn't have a name for yet, and wasn't in a hurry to name. Some things needed time before you named them. Named too early, they became the wrong thing. We should go back, she said. Not yet, he said. She looked at him. He reached into his coat and took out a small carved marker. Stone, roughly worked, not a craftsman's piece. The kind of thing a person made themselves when they wanted to make sure they made it, rather than waiting for it to be made well. He had carved Sable's name into it, she saw. Plain letters, no ornament. And below the name, the date of the boundary territory reclassification. He crouched down and pushed it into the frozen ground at the base of the boundary marker. It wasn't deep enough. The ground was too hard, but it stood at an angle that was close enough to vertical. He stood back up and looked at it. It's not enough, he said again, the same words he had said in the Chronicle room 3 weeks ago. No, she said again, but it's real. He looked at the marker for a long moment. Then he looked at her, and the thing in his face was not the calculation and not the authority and not the controlled stillness she had spent 10 days cataloging. It was something underneath all of that, something that the cataloging had been covering the whole time, older and considerably more honest. She looked back at him. The forest held its cold silence around them. The boundary trees standing the same as they had stood for 100 years and would stand after both of them were gone. And the small carved marker sat crooked in the frozen ground at the base of the old sigil stone, and the snow came down in the particular quiet way that snow came down when there was no wind to argue with it. Lyra thought about what it meant to build something on an honest foundation rather than a buried one. The honest foundation was harder to work with. It had cracks in it. It required you to know exactly what you were standing on, rather than the comfortable fiction that the ground beneath you was solid all the way down. But it held. That was the thing about honest foundations. They held in ways that the buried ones never did, because what was buried eventually surfaced, and what surfaced had to be reckoned with, and the reckoning always cost more than the honesty would have. 100 years had taught Valor that. She was 32 years old and had learned it in 10 days and in 24 years before them, in the shape of a silver wolf who had known, without being told and without asking for acknowledgement, that some things were simply worth holding. She turned from the boundary marker and walked back toward the horses. After a moment, she heard Kalen's footsteps in the snow behind her. They rode south together as the winter light began to fail, and the forest closed behind them, and the boundary marker stood in the cold with Sable's name in it, and the silence of the northern territory held it the way it had always held the things it was given, without comment, without ceremony, with the deep and particular patience of something that had been there long before any of it began and intended to remain long after. The kingdom behind them was broken in places and intact in others, and in the slow process of learning which was which. That was, Lyra thought, the most honest thing a kingdom could be. She rode on.